At exactly 3:17 a.m., the windows began to rattle due to a tremor. 4-year-old Angelia Clarke started screaming in her San Diego home while everyone else was still asleep. Her mother saw her in the hallway. She was leaning against the wall. She had covered her ears with her small hands. Tears were streaming down her face. "It is coming! It is coming again!" Most of San Diego felt this earthquake while asleep. A few people shared on social media about dishes rattling or dogs barking. Local news briefly reported it the next morning. California reminded everyone that they were on fault lines that never truly rested. The Clarke family barely noticed. Her father, David, woke up suddenly. He felt the bed shake slightly. Then he fell back asleep. But Angelia had started screaming. When Rachel reached her daughter's room, she found Angelia leaning against the wall between her bed and the window. Angelia's eyes were open, but she didn't seem to see her mother. She was looking at something else, somewhere else. "Angelia, baby, everything's okay. It was just a small earthquake. It is over now." Angelia shook her head violently. "It is coming again. There is going to be a much bigger earthquake." Rachel took her daughter in her arms. She felt Angelia's rapid heartbeat against her chest. "Nothing is coming, sweetheart. Everything is fine." The earthquake was mild. It was a 3.2 magnitude, barely mentioned in the news, but Angelia's reaction was anything but mild. For the next 6 hours, she spoke in a different tone of voice. Angelia began to recount in that tone of voice. "It was early in the morning in 1906. First, there was a terrifying sound, as if the world were breaking apart. Then the ground began to split open. Buildings collapsed like dominoes." Her mother tried to calm her down, but Angelia continued talking. "Then there was a firefighters couldn't put it out. There was no water. The pipes were broken. Everything burned. Everywhere burned." She described streets her family never mentioned. She listed the names of buildings that no longer existed. Then she said something that shocked her father. Mr. Castellano couldn't get out. His shop on Mason Street collapsed. They never found him. The family had never discussed the 1906 San Francisco earthquake with Angelia. They had never visited the city. It was strange for a 4-year-old child to know that the water mains had burst, and the city had burned for 3 days. There was no way she could have known that the firefighters were helpless. You are about to witness a case that will force historians to reopen century-old archives and confront a possibility that defies all logical explanation. The Clarke family was an ordinary family in every way. They lived in a modest house in North Park. They were a family that did not believe in past lives or paranormal events. Angelia was a bright and cheerful child. In February, when the earth shook and she felt something inside her crack, there was nothing unusual about her. Angelia did not sleep at all that night of the earthquake. She sat on the couch between her mother and father, staring at the wall. In the morning, Angelia spoke in a voice that surprised Rachel. It was morning. The sky was brightening, but the sun had not yet risen. When the big earthquake came, a sound was heard from the depths of the earth first. It was as if something huge was moving under the city. Then the shaking began. It wasn't a slight tremor like tonight. The ground was shaking in waves. I couldn't stand up. Buildings were swaying back and forth. Some were newly built. There were large, luxurious buildings in the city center. They cracked like eggs. The brick buildings were even worse. They shattered. Walls fell into the streets. People were screaming. Rachel and David listened to their daughter's story with worried eyes. 4-year-olds didn't talk like this. This wasn't normal fear. "Angelia, where did you see this? Did you see it on television?" Angelia finally looked at her mother. For a moment, Rachel saw something old in her daughter's eyes. "I was there when the city was destroyed." For the next 3 hours, Angelia told them everything. She described how the earthquake struck at 5:12 a.m. on the 18th of April, 1906. She described people running into the streets in their pajamas, how the wealthy neighborhoods south of Market Street were the hardest hit. She described the dome of City Hall cracking. She knew the earthquake lasted between 45 seconds and a minute, depending on where you were. She knew the real destruction happened when fires started breaking out across the city due to overturned stoves and broken gas lines. The firefighters came right away. They were brave. They worked very hard. But when they connected their hoses to the hydrants and opened the valves, no water came out. There was only air and then a drop of water. The earthquake had destroyed the city's water network. The reservoirs were intact, but the pipes carrying the water had broken. There was no water to fight the fire. They had to watch the flames spread. David was taking notes on his phone to show these to the pediatrician. Angelia was recounting details she vaguely remembered from history class years ago. She had never discussed such topics with her daughter. The fire lasted 3 days. Firefighters tried to create a firebreak by dynamiting buildings in the path of the fire, but most didn't know how to use dynamite properly. They either used too much or placed it incorrectly. This created more debris that fed the flames. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see the sun. People took what they could and fled to Golden Gate Park and the Presidio. Some went to the ferry building and crossed the bay to Oakland, but most stayed behind to try to save their homes, their businesses, everything they had built. Mr. Castellano stayed. His store was on Mason Street between Geary and O'Farrell. When the earthquake hit, the building next door collapsed. It fell on top of his store. He was trapped in the basement of his shop. People heard his cries for help. They tried to dig through the rubble, but fires had started at both ends of the block. They had to make a choice. They might die trying to save one man, or they might escape and survive. Everyone fled, and Mr. Castellano burned. The room fell silent. Angelia was crying, but she wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for a man who had died 113 years before she was born, a man whose name neither David nor Rachel had ever heard. Dr. Michael Brennan had spent 32 years at UC San Diego studying child psychology. He had heard every kind of childhood fantasy imaginable. When Rachel Clarke called his office in early March and recounted her daughter's detailed earthquake story, Dr. Brennan thought it was just another case of overactive imagination combined with anxious parents who allowed their child to watch too many documentary programs. He agreed to examine Angelia on Thursday afternoon. It was equipped with shelves full of toys designed to comfort children. Angelia entered, holding her mother's hand. She looked like any other 4-year-old. Dr. Brennan invited her to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk with a warm smile. Angelia, your mother told me you have frightening thoughts about earthquakes. Can you tell me about that? Angelia looked at him with an expression that seemed very serious for her age. These aren't thoughts, they're all memories. Dr. Brennan nodded. Okay, tell me about those memories. For the next 45 minutes, Angelia repeated everything she had told her parents. She described the smell of gas in the air after the earthquake, the bells ringing as churches collapsed, how the paving stones on the street buckled and formed waves on the sidewalk. She described soldiers being called in from the Presidio to patrol the streets and prevent looting, and how they were ordered to shoot on sight if they saw looters. She described martial law being declared. She knew that Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan had been seriously injured when the fire station collapsed, and that the fire department had lost its leader at the worst possible moment. Dr. Brennan hadn't expected such detailed information. She tried a different approach. She pulled out historical photographs of San Francisco from various periods. Do you recognize any of these? Angelia looked at the photos. These are all recent photos. Show me earlier ones. He opened a street photo from 1905 showing the grand buildings and streetcars of Market Street. Angelia leaned forward. Her small hand reached out to the screen. This is it. This is what it looked like. Do you see that building? That building collapsed. Its entire front fell into the street. I saw it. Dr. Brennan hesitated for the first time in his skepticism. He asked her tricky questions, showing her modern photos labeled as historical, asking her to identify buildings that never existed. Angelia caught every trap. This isn't real. That building was constructed later. You are testing me. I am trying to understand what you remember, Angelia. Can you tell me about the people? Angelia continued her story. Everyone was scared, but they helped each other. People who had lost everything shared what little they had. Wealthy ladies from Nob Hill cooked meals on the streets, alongside Chinese immigrants from the burned-out apartments. The earthquake didn't care if you were rich or poor, neither did the fire. It took everything. Then she returned to the subject that troubled her most. But Mr. Castellano, he stayed. He died alone. No one remembers him. His family never knew what happened to him. They thought he had escaped and died somewhere else, either in the fire or from his injuries. But he didn't escape. He was trapped in the basement. The fire killed him. Someone should remember him. After the session, Dr. Brennan wanted to speak privately with David and Rachel. The professional composure on her face was gone. I don't know what to tell you. Either your daughter somehow accessed extremely specific historical information, or he stopped before finishing his sentence. It might be a good idea to talk to someone who specializes in the 1906 earthquake. You need to verify what she said, because if even half of what she described is true, it is beyond my expertise. The Clarke family left San Francisco State University. Dr. Hammond was a historian who had written 3 books about the 1906 disaster. When Rachel called him the next day and explained the situation, Dr. Hammond's initial reaction was to politely decline. I understand your concern, but children often get information from sources their parents are unaware of. There are documentaries, books, even video games about historical disasters. He knew about the water system. He knew about Dennis Sullivan. He knew the fire lasted 3 days. He described the fire breaks and the blasting. And he knows the name of a man who died. He knows the name of Thomas Castellano, who owned a fabric store on Mason Street. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. What did you say his name was? Thomas Castellano, Mason Street, between Geary and O'Farrell. This time there was an even longer silence. I need to check something. Can I call you back? Dr. Hammond called back 3 hours later. I found him. His name is on the list of missing persons compiled by relief organizations after the fire. Thomas Castellano, 42 years old, fabric merchant. Last known address, a shop on Mason Street. Never found. Presumed dead. The file also mentions his surviving wife, Maria, and 2 daughters. The case was never solved because the body was never found, and there was no definitive proof of death. There was only an absence. Mrs. Clarke, I need to speak with your daughter. Will you bring her to San Francisco? 2 weeks later, the Clarke family set out for the city where Angelia claimed to remember her last moments. As they crossed the Bay Bridge and the San Francisco skyline came into view, Angelia pressed her hand against the window. Everything looks so different now. The buildings have completely changed. Everything is different, but the hills are the same. The bay is the same. Dr. Hammond had arranged to meet them at the California Historical Society on Mission Street. Dr. Hammond was waiting in the lobby. She was a tall woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. She shook David and Rachel's hands. Then she bent down to Angelia's level. Hello, Angelia. My name is Patricia. I've been researching what happened in this city a long time ago. Your family said you remember some things about that time. Would you like to tell me about it? Angelia replied, I'll tell you what I know. I want to go to Mason Street. I need to see if anything remains. Dr. Hammond's expression changed. Something between admiration and concern appeared. We can do that. But first, I want to show you some things. I'll show you documents and photographs. You must tell me if anything looks familiar. They spent the next 2 hours in a special archive room. Dr. Hammond brought out maps of San Francisco from 1905, photographs of streets and buildings, and lists of the missing and deceased. Angelia examined them. She corrected details in headlines written by historians who hadn't witnessed the event firsthand. She identified locations where fire prevention efforts had been made. Dr. Hammond pulled a folder from the archive. This folder contained handwritten statements from survivors, compiled by relief workers in the months following the disaster. Most of these had never been published. They had not been digitized and had never been examined by anyone other than the initial receiving officers. He spread them out on the table. He watched Angelia's reaction. Angelia's hand rested on a 3-page statement written in tight handwriting on yellowed paper. This document is about Mason Street. The document came from a grocer named Robert Chen, whose shop was 2 doors down from Castellano's fabric store. It described the collapse of the building, the attempts to rescue the man trapped in the basement, the approaching fire, the impossible decision to flee. At the bottom of the 3rd page he had written, I can still hear the cries for help. I see them in my dreams. We should have tried harder. His name was Thomas Castellano. He deserved better than to die alone in the dark. Angelia looked at Dr. Hammond. Tears were streaming down her face. He wasn't alone in the dark. The fire gave light. That was the worst part. He could see the fire coming. The archive room fell silent. Dr. Hammond sat down in his chair. His academic skepticism was crumbling in the face of details that no one could possibly know, especially that a 4-year-old child who had never set foot in San Francisco could not possibly know. We have to go to Mason Street. Mason Street had been rebuilt years ago. The ruins of 1906 had been transformed into a corridor of modern boutique hotels, restaurants, and residential buildings with shops on the ground floor. The street bore no resemblance to the photographs Angelia had studied in the archives. The low brick buildings had been replaced by structures of steel and glass. But when Dr. Hammond's car turned onto the street from Geary, Angelia leaned forward in her seat. Her breath caught. The shop was there, right there. Dr. Hammond parked the car on the curb. Angelia walked to a spot in front of a modern coffee shop with pastries and expensive espresso machines displayed in its windows. She knelt on the curb and placed both palms flat on the concrete. The basement was about 3.5 meters below here. The stairs went down behind the shop. When the adjacent building collapsed, the wall was pushed inward. The upper floor collapsed. The stairs were blocked. That is why he couldn't get out. Dr. Hammond had brought a file containing the property records he had obtained that morning. According to city archives, this lot belonged to the Castellano family from 1898 to 1907. Then it was sold to divide the inheritance. The lot sat vacant for 2 years after the fire. Then it was rebuilt. The current building was constructed in 1953. But there is something else. While excavating for the 1953 construction, the workers submitted a report to the city. The report is in the construction department archives. They found the remains of the previous building's foundations. There are partially collapsed stone walls, and they found something else. Rachel asked, "What did they find?" Human remains from the fire were found. They were turned over to the medical examiner, but there was no way to identify them. Dozens of victims from 1906 had never been found, so they were buried in a mass grave at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park, along with other unidentified remains from the disaster. Dr. Hammond's eyes were shining with emotion. "I searched the cemetery this morning. According to the burial records, the remains found during construction at 347 Mason Street on the 14th of June, 1953, were buried. The plot number is the same. This is the exact spot." David Clarke recorded everything on his phone. He looked at the sidewalk where his daughter was kneeling. So Thomas Castellano was found 50 years later. But his identity was never confirmed. His name was never linked to those remains. His family never knew. The case remained open as a missing person. Angelia slowly stood up. She shook her hands. She looked down the street. Her eyes followed the path the fire would take. Their daughters' names were Anna and Catherine. Anna was 12. Catherine was 9. They waited for him at their aunt's house in Oakland. They waited for weeks. His wife Maria returned to the city as soon as people were allowed back. She walked down Mason Street. But nothing remained. Only rubble and ash. She searched for 3 years. She had a heart attack, but really she died of grief. Anna and Catherine grew up without their parents. Anna never married. Catherine moved to Los Angeles. She had 4 children but never spoke of the earthquake. She couldn't. It was too painful. Dr. Hammond's hand shook as he took notes. "Angelia, how do you know about the girls? How do you know what happened to the family?" Angelia turned and looked at him. For a moment that strange, ancient quality returned to her eyes. "Because I lived through it all. Because some memories don't end with death, they continue. They watch what happens to those left behind. Even if you are no longer there, part of the story, you see how the story ends." Dr. Hammond closed the file and stared at Angelia for a long time. "I spent my entire career studying this earthquake. I read thousands of survivors' statements. I analyzed photographs, maps, building records, death certificates. I wrote 3 books claiming to tell the definitive history of this disaster. And now I realize that everything I thought I knew is incomplete. Because history is written by those who survived to tell the tale, and many did not survive. Many stories were lost. Thank you for remembering Thomas Castellano. Thank you for ensuring he is not forgotten." Angelia nodded, but her attention had shifted elsewhere. She was looking at the building that housed the coffee shop. She was carefully examining its facade. "Can we go inside?" In the afternoon, the coffee shop was almost empty. A barista was wiping down the tables. Angelia walked past them indifferently. She headed toward the back of the shop where a door marked "Employees Only" led to the storage and office area. Rachel started to call her back, but Dr. Hammond put his hand on her arm. "Let's see where she is going." A young man with a beard and an apron covered in coffee stains cut them off. "Excuse me, that area is not for customers." Dr. Hammond pulled out her university ID. "I am Dr. Patricia Hammond from San Francisco State. This is part of a historical research project. Can we look at your basement? It is very important." The man's skeptical attitude was clear, but something in Dr. Hammond's tone made him hesitate. "We don't use the basement much. It is just an old storage room. There are a few boxes of supplies." He led them to a narrow wooden door that resembled the original construction from the 1950s. The door opened onto steep stairs leading down into darkness. The man pressed a button. It illuminated the narrow basement with its stone walls. Boxes were stacked along one wall. The air was thick with the smell of dampness. When Angelia descended, she walked straight to the far wall, which faced the adjacent building from 1906. The wall was made of stone. It was clearly much older than the building above it. "This stone is loose." The manager looked surprised. "I never noticed that." David examined the stone Angelia was pointing at. It was darker in color than the other stones around it. When he pressed on it, it shifted slightly. "She is right. This stone moves." He ran his fingers along the edges of the stone. "There is a gap here. It looks like it was removed and put back in place. Do you have a crowbar or something?" 5 minutes later, David removed the stone with a small crowbar borrowed from the manager's toolbox. Angelia approached and stood on tiptoe to see inside. "There is something there." Dr. Hammond shone his phone's light into the gap. A small rectangular metal box sat inside the gap. It was heavily rusted and worn, but it was solid. He carefully removed the box. It was about the size of a large book. They carried it upstairs. The manager cleared a table. They placed the box on the desk. Dr. Hammond photographed it from every angle before attempting to open it. When he applied pressure, the latch broke. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now just scraps, was a leather-bound diary. The diary was remarkably well preserved, thanks to the metal box, the oilcloth wrapping, and the dry environment of the wall cavity. Dr. Hammond opened the diary with trembling hands. On the first page, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "The Personal Diary of Thomas Castellano," written in the days before the earthquake and fire of April 1906 and on the morning of the disaster. The diary began in March 1906. The entries were the ordinary thoughts of an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Then came an entry dated the 18th of April, 1906, noted at 5:28 a.m. The handwriting was shaky. It was clearly written in haste. "The earthquake struck at 5:12 and I am trapped in the basement. The neighboring building collapsed onto my shop. The floor caved in. The stairs are blocked. I can hear the sound of fire outside. I can smell smoke. I am writing this in case someone finds it. Tell Maria and the girls that I love them. Tell them I am sorry I can't come home. The smoke is getting thicker. I don't have much time left." The entry ended in the middle of a sentence. The last words faded away, illegible. Everyone looked at the diary as if it were sacred. Angelia reached out. She touched the diary gently. Now they can write his name on his grave. Now his daughter's children and grandchildren can learn what happened. Now he is not lost. Now he can rest in peace. Dr. Hammond looked at Angelia with fear. "How did you know the diary was there? How did you know about the loose stone?" Angelia met his gaze with determination. "Because I put the diary there. When the shaking stopped and I realized I was trapped, I wrote the last entry. Then I wrapped the diary in the tarpaulin I used to protect the fabric shipments. I put it in the safe in my shop, and I hid it in the hollow in the stone wall that I had noticed weeks earlier and wanted to repair. I hid it there hoping that one day someone would find it. I hoped Maria would understand what it was, but no one came in time." Dr. Hammond carefully closed the diary and put it back in the box. His hands were shaking. His entire understanding of reality had been shaken. He had spent 30 years as a skeptical, rational academic, dealing with facts and evidence. Thomas Castellano's diary was verified by 3 independent experts over the next 6 months. All confirmed it was written between 1905 and 1906. The entries in the diary matched perfectly with known facts about the earthquake. The final entry, written in the helpless minutes after the earthquake, perfectly matched the structural damage models documented by engineers investigating the disaster. There was no reasonable way to fake this. There was no logical explanation for it having remained hidden in that wall for over a century, surviving numerous renovations and inspections. But more importantly, it was impossible to explain how a 4-year-old girl from San Diego knew exactly where to find it. This story made national news for a short time. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence or fraud. Believers accepted it as proof of reincarnation, of spirits returning to unfinished business. Angelia Clarke is now 9 years old. She no longer speaks of the earthquake with the same urgency. But she has not forgotten Thomas Castellano. The diary remains accessible to researchers in the archives of the California Historical Society. Do you believe Angelia Clarke truly carries Thomas Castellano's memories? Or do you think this is just an extraordinary coincidence? A child with extraordinary access to historical information and an extraordinary imagination. San Francisco is expecting another earthquake. When it comes, it will create new tragedies, new stories, new names to add to the lists of the lost and dead. And perhaps, decades later, some of these stories will return. Subscribe to join us as we uncover the next mystery, the next impossible story, the next case that challenges everything we think we know about memory, death, and the enduring power of truth that survives even when everything else turns to ash.